Hello, and thank you for joining me for this evening's Lundy lecture. I'm Michael Williams, and I'm Secretary of the Lundy Field Society. I have made a virtual return to the Morisco Tavern this evening, which you can see behind me, as I didn't really fancy appearing on a cliff edge with nesting seabirds behind me. Tonight, I'm really pleased to be joined by Professor Tom Dickins, who's going to be speaking to us about his long-term study of the breeding kittiwakes on Lundy. Kittiwakes are unusual as they are a cliff nesting gull species, which makes their life very hard. We have certainly seen the breeding success of Lundy's kittiwakes plummet in recent years, and I'm hoping that Tom will tell us why this might be. If you're joining us for the first time, you're very welcome. There are a few housekeeping matters to go through before I introduce our speaker. Only the microphones and video cameras on Tom's computer and my computer are enabled, so we won't be able to see or hear any of you watching at home. Those of you who are on Zoom are able to ask questions using the Q&A function. You need to click the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and then type your question into the box that pops up. And if you're on a mobile or a tablet, then you can find it on the menu bar. We have plenty of time for questions at the end. There's also a chat feature for comments and feedback, which we'll be monitoring during the talk. If you're watching on YouTube, you're also very welcome, but unfortunately, there's no facility for asking questions. As ever, Dave Richards is behind the scenes hosting the Zoom session, and a recording will be made available afterwards. So it's time for me to introduce our speaker and give you a brief biography. Hopefully Tom will be there.
Hello.
Are you there, Tom? Hello.
Hello.
So Tom is Professor of Behavioural Science at Middlesex University. He's been coming to Lundy since 1980, and back then he was a guest on his father's animal behaviour field trip for students at the University of Liverpool. That introduction was sufficient to create addiction. I know how it feels. And Tom came on many more field trips, transitioning to act as his father's research assistant, and then bringing his own students and his family before he fully inherited the project. Tom is interested in evolutionary functions of behaviour. So Tom, it's great to have you here. It's time to hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and I'm very pleased to be here and very grateful for the invitation to speak to everybody, and thank you for everybody who's giving up their evening to come and hear me talk. So I'm going to move over now to share my screen and begin the talk. And okay. So you've already had the title, and Michael's already let you know that I'm going to be telling you about a long-term study about kittiwakes, but what I'm going to be telling you is the beginnings of that long-term study. So this all began for us really formally in 2015, when our team at the Behavioural Science Lab at Middlesex University decided to do something about kittiwakes, and that's very much related to Michael's comments about the population decline, which I shall come to. The team are Kirsty Neller and Amanda Mead. Kirsty's been working on this project all the time since before 2015, really. And Amanda's just joined us and rather unfortunately has lost her first breeding season due to the current pandemic. So I do feel very sorry for her, but she's nonetheless had data to look at, and of course myself. So what I'm going to do is give you some basics about kittiwakes for those of you who aren't sure about them, but I'm sure many of you listening will actually know quite a lot about them, so I don't want to overdo the basics. But I'm going to move in from that into what I call a kind of theoretical interlude, and I want to think about some issues around clutch size, or the number of eggs that a bird chooses to lay in a breeding season. And then I'm going to talk about the initial questions that we developed after having these thoughts, how we developed some methods for collecting some aspects of the data, and then our early findings. So when I talk about kittiwakes, the first thing to note is I'm actually talking about black-legged kittiwakes, which you can see here nesting in the background of one of our sites on Lundy. Oh, sorry, this is flipping through. As you can see from this site, they are a cliff nesting bird, which is a topic I shall return to. Kittiwakes are the most common gull species worldwide, in fact, and they're also very long-living bird species, getting up to around 28 years. In fact, I believe one's been recorded having passed the 30 mark recently. The cliff nesting is an unusual habit, and as I say, I'm going to discuss that a little bit later. They breed seasonally, so right at this moment they're busy breeding. They will have some eggs hatching about now, I'm hoping, on the sites that we monitor normally. And when they are fledged, assuming they do fledge, they generally leave the colony that they were hatched at and go and recruit, when they're ready to breed, to another colony somewhere else, which can either be near at hand or farther away. But once they decide upon a colony to set up in for their own breeding effort, they then have pretty high nest site loyalty, which is one of the useful factors about kittiwakes, which makes them quite easy to pursue across many years, which is what we're interested in. So we can monitor a nest and be fairly sure that that nest is being consistently used for a number of years by the same birds. They're highly monogamous, so they pair bond for life if they can, although they do get divorced. Divorce in seabirds is usually to do with breeding failure. So if there's some infertility in the couple or something like that, then they may well separate and try and find other partners. But without that impediment, then these birds stay together for life. Then clutch sizes range, so the number of eggs they have in a clutch ranges from 1 to 3. And we'll talk quite a bit about that later. So that's the kind of the basics of these birds. But in spite of being the most common gull worldwide, they are actually now red listed here. And that's because there's been a 40% decline in breeding populations over more than 40 years now. And there are a number of reasons that have been hypothesized for that generally across the entire population. Many of them focus upon potential population changes in sand eels, which are a principal food source for kittiwakes, particularly during breeding, when they basically more or less specialize in catching year zero sand eels to feed to their offspring. Those sand eels may have dispersed elsewhere due to changes in sea temperature through climate change. So they may have gone with colder currents further north. They may also have gone deeper in the water column because sea surface temperatures have warmed up, and basically they like cold water. As kittiwakes are surface divers to about 50 centimeters or so, it's possible they're getting too deep for kittiwakes to catch. And so that will move kittiwake populations away from breeding waters around here, potentially. But there are other aspects that might impact on it as well, including commercial overfishing, because sand eels are used in various products and have been, marine contaminants, and also introduced species, changing community ecology in fish stocks, and general visual disturbance, again, an anthropogenic source of problems in the marine environment. But all of these hypotheses are out there. They're not necessarily exclusive, but the one that's principally pursued seems to be changes in sand eel populations. But what's interesting about that pursuit is that most of these studies have in fact focused upon populations to the north of the UK, and very little has been done in the south, which is where we're hoping to make a contribution. So this brings us immediately to Lundy, which, as you've heard from Michael, I was introduced to as well, a 10-year-old boy. I shall confess my age. So in 1980, I was 10 when I went across. My father was working on kittiwakes. So I extracted this data when I started to develop our own interests in this project from about 1981, as I hope you, sorry, I should be using my cursor, as you can see from this graph. And what you got here is basically the number of apparently occupied nests on the whole island. And it starts at 933 and effectively exponentially declines to the 2013 point where I stopped, putting data in to 127 apparently occupied nests. So as you can see, that's a steep decline. And in fact, if you push the data further back in time, then there were many more nesting birds prior to that period. And I often think, actually, having sort of watched this happen over this period, that you could almost draw a map with the dot for all the original colonies on and just watch them disappearing over time, over a kind of time-lapse video. More or less, those colonies would disappear from the northeast corner of the island, which is the Puff and Gully colony, which was the main colony my father worked, and also Denver Daniels at Exeter and people like that back in the 70s and 80s. all the way around to where we're working today, and I shall come to that. So there's been this kind of definite shift away from those sites of Kittiwakes over this time. So we were worried about that. So this is where we ended up at what is called by us and by Becky Aztec Zorn, but for those of you who don't call it that, you'll see in this image in the top right corner, the straight line sort of more or less running left to right is actually 3/4 wall. So you're dropping down there to 3/4 wall bay basically. And you can almost see the desire lines on this Google Earth image running down the sidings to where our observation site is for this particular colony. And I've drawn a line there to show you the line of sight from our observation spot. And that's actually 116 meters, more or less. According to Google metrics, you always have to be a bit skeptical about that, but it's close enough for us to get good sights of the nests, the birds, and any eggs and chicks in the nests using binoculars and telescopes and large camera lenses. So it's a good spot to make observations, and principally it's a good spot to make observations without disturbing the birds as well, which of course we don't want to do given the parlous state of their populations. So basically in 2014, I was sat down on that observation site and watching these birds, as I had done for many years, and realized that we really needed to do something about this. So we transitioned in 2015 to start formally studying at this site initially. So to do that, I went back again and looked at data that is readily available through some of the Lundy publications, but also through the JNCC seabird monitoring activities, and just pulled the Aztec Zorn data from 2008, to 2015. And you can see here on this first figure that you've got the number of active nests here. And basically what I'm hoping to show you here is that there's been a general increase in that period up to when we began studying in active nests, with a slight dip in 2013. But when you then take those self-same nests at the Zorn and look at the breeding success data across those years, you can see that that's a bit more noisy. So actually breeding success was good early on, 2009, 2010 in percentage terms, as it is expressed here. So percentage of active nests that successfully bred. But then there's a lot more noise in the data. So it's not a clear story of this colony burgeoning. There's noise in here. So in a sense, what we've done is drilled into that larger curve that I showed you at the beginning to see how the variance kind of works. This, of course, isn't sufficient to generate an explanation, but it gave us some insight into what was going on. So we were looking at all of this and we were looking at that kind of data. And then we thought, well, is this really quite the right thing to count? And what should we be counting and why? So what is really going on with the kind of data I've shown you with the apparently occupied nest counts is that you are literally counting occupancy in terms of turning up at a site, scanning it, and usually you're on quite a time constraint when you're doing lots of these in a day, as many of you I'm sure know, and just determining whether or not there's an adult bird on the nest, usually sitting on the nest, but you can count standing if you wish. And then you use that as an indicator of breeding effort. You assume that the bird is there to use the nest for its purpose. This is in fact problematic, and the problems are well documented. The Kittiwakes, like many seabirds, have what we call sabbatical years. So they take a year off having kids, which is something I can sympathise with at the moment, having had a difficult evening. They will still nonetheless go to those nests because, as I indicated before, they like to retain the same nest throughout their breeding life. So they're very loyal, so they like to defend their territory effectively. But nonetheless, sometimes birds sitting on nests are actually just temporarily sitting there as well because they've seen an opportunity to have a rest because no other birds are around. And these two factors tend to overestimation in terms of the actual breeding activity at the sites. In fact, at times it can get up to about 20% overestimation, according to notable sources like Bibby. For those of you who do surveys, you will have looked at Bibby stuff, I'm sure. What we're really interested in as behavioural ecologists, as behavioural scientists, is the core issue here of how Kittiwakes are actually responding to the ecological circumstances. And we've indicated the general discussion around food resource, but there are other things as well that might be affecting what's going on with their breeding effort. And so to start with, we realised that actually we really need to have a better measure, and that really should be the number of eggs that birds are laying in the first instance. Never mind whether they're turning up, are they actually going through to a laying session, and then through to hopefully looking after chicks and so forth. Clutch size is an extremely interesting variable and much written about in the behavioural ecological literature, because it's such a fundamental aspect of bird life. It's how more birds turn up, of course. We know lots of things about it from seminal work from David Lack going forward, really from the 1940s onwards, although there was work prior to that too. So we know stuff about how clutch size varies with food availability. If food resources are scarce, then it makes more sense to have fewer or maybe even no eggs and take a sabbatical year, because you won't have sufficient resources not only to build an energy-rich egg, but also to then feed the chicks that emerge from it afterwards. Related to that, we know that clutch size is modified by the amount of effort that has to be put in to find food. So that's not just about its availability, but how easy it is to access it and to handle it and process it, but also things to do with the cost of maintaining the adult body. It might be that particular seasons are more inclement in terms of weather and temperature fluctuations, and so more energy is needed to maintain your own life as an adult, and that might reduce investment in eggs. And the cost of reproduction can also be more or less, depending on where you are in your life history. More general life history considerations also play a big role in this. If you are under some kind of duress or stress in the present breeding season, it might make sense to conserve energy so that you can be more successful in a future reproductive effort in the next breeding season. Some of this work is also done, of course, on birds that have more than one clutch during the year. And kittiwakes tend not to do that. Occasionally they will, but they're a single clutch species, really. And then there's the whole issue about whether to invest in the quality of your offspring and have fewer and put the food that you can find into growing big, strong and competitive individual chicks who will then go on to reproduce successfully as adults, or whether you go for quantity and produce less robust chicks, but more of them who might statistically make it through particular kinds of risk. So lots of interesting trade-offs going on for these birds as they make effectively physiological decisions about how many eggs to have. Predation also has an influence on clutch size, and there's a number of reasons that might be. For example, smaller clutches might be harder to find under heavy predation regimes, but also they're easier to replace, particularly if they're predated early in the season. And they reduce parental costs in terms of maintaining hatched eggs, and so more chicks, which then might mean there's more opportunity to guard against predators and to put into effort into vigilance and that kind of stuff. So that's another aspect to the decision-making process. So I talk about this quite openly as decisions, even though we're really seeing this as physiological responses to ecological cues. That's pretty much what any kind of decision is. It can either be neurophysiology, or it can be something elsewhere in the hierarchy of physiological effects. So that's kind of the theoretical background to what we're interested in for this part of the project. Another thing to point out, though, is that this is a colonial seabird, and we can assume things about colonies being good, basically, for the kittiwake across its lifetime. We know breeding is a vulnerable period for numerous reasons, and that the colonial life will actually probably reduce predation risk just statistically, because you're less likely to be predated if there are more of you, but also by having more eyes on and more predator response. So you're more likely to get away from any attack. But it might also be the case that colonial life brings what we call social information to the birds in the group, and in particular about food resource. So to put it in sort of colloquial or anecdotal terms, if you're sat next to another kittiwake on a ledge who keeps coming back every day from the northwest after a 2-hour flight with lots and lots of sand eels, it would make sense to pay attention to that behavior and estimate that that would be a good place to sort of head, or even to follow that bird and gather the same food resources as he or she is. That kind of social information sharing may well be fairly evenly distributed across time throughout the colony, but it might not be as well. It might be the case that some birds are actually much better at finding food and others take advantage of that. And so you get a ratio of a certain number of producing birds who can find stuff to a certain number of scroungers who just basically freeload, in a sense, off the other birds. If those are not evenly spread in the colony, that might also be another issue for colony failure, that you may have a reducing ratio of good foraging birds within your colony. So there's all kinds of things in the background here. This is all about the decisions that these birds have to make. So we started thinking in those broad theoretical terms, and we realized that there were key issues about colonies, such as their terrain constraints. So this is a picture of the central portion of Aztec Zorn. And you can see that the birds are on various types of ledges, and they're kind of organized in various little patches, but you'll also notice that lots of the ledges simply are not used. And so we were intrigued to know why that might be. We know that there are often disputes on nest sites. So this is a photograph of, again, a nest on Aztec Zorn, one of the nests we regard as more successful. Two birds in the background are the owners, if you like, of the site, and the one with its wings outstretched is an interloper, and spent a long time during that day trying to oust these two birds from this nest. This was early on in the season before laying. That happens quite a lot, and this leads us to think these birds must know something about the value of real estate, and they must be eyeing up with covetous eyes, you know, the best nest in the block kind of thing. So they're not unlike us in some ways. And then, as I've said, there are predation risks. And this is, again, on the same colony. This lesser blackback has managed here to land, sort of, well, not quite land, managed to kind of balance itself whilst using its wings, as you can see, but for long enough to be stationary to get this egg. And it later came back and finished the job and cleared that entire nest. And this was in 2015. That nest was never used again. Well, hasn't been since then. But that might be being used now. Obviously, I haven't been on the island this season, but basically that was the end of that as a breeding effort. But if you look at that nest, sorry, it's quite well built up. So it had previously been used for quite a while. So we were interested in, you know, what made that nest sort of work for a bit. Why was it chosen, and is that risk unusual? So there's a bunch of parameters. Also included in here is the idea that particular parts of the colony might be more exposed to elements, which will have an impact on breeding success. And population density will increase, the number of disputes, and the predation risk. So we took all this to Quarry Beach, or I did. I went there with my brother, and he put up with me talking about this for hours. He works on viruses, so he has a different kind of focus on the world, and he's quite busy, as you might imagine, presently. So work through what I wanted to do initially, and then talk to the rest of the team. And we decided we'd sort of explore the idea of certain nest positions being more vulnerable to predation, and maybe neighborhood effects might kind of offset predation, but maybe increase disputes. So how did we do this? Well, we started off by mapping the colony, and we chose to do this in a way that isn't actually the standard way, on Lundy at least, which is to digitally photograph and use that, but rather to hand draw. So we got to know the geology and geography of the site. And we found that was a better way to kind of more intimately know the site. But we did cross-check this with digital photographs and made sure it was all calibrated appropriately, and then calibrated our nest numbers and so forth between the observers in the team. But typically we would end up on the site with a map like that as a reference point. After a few days, we would know all the nests individually that season. Then each day we would arrive, this is over a sort of a 2 week period, and we would do a standard apparently occupied nest survey using RSPB sort of techniques, which you can see here in the status column, where we would have C for an adult present with 1 egg in it with the C/1, or I for an apparently sort of incubating nest, and various other designations, just to get a basic idea of what's going on, because that data is still useful. Then we would spend the rest of the day, many, many hours, doing opportunity sampling, just waiting for those birds to move on the nests, because they don't just stand up and say, hey, Tom, Kirsty, here's the eggs, please count. They sit tight on them because they're looking after them. So we have to be very patient, and you get used to behavioral indices of when these birds are going to move. And so you get used to scanning and looking for those, and then you zone in and you get the data, but it takes a long time. In the interim, we also measured other behaviors, taking notes on courtship, attempted copulations, predation threats, and so forth. And then this led us to have a whole pile of numbers, and we had to decide what was the best average to use, bearing in mind that there was missing data, because you can never see quite all of the nests, and you can never see into quite all of a nest on every occasion. And we got to the best day method, where we counted eggs from the day with the least missing data and used an average from that. Or the last day, we had an available egg count for each nest was used. And we found that actually those two produced very similar estimates of clutch size. And we can then estimate what the average clutch size was for the colony using standard descriptive statistics. So that all sounds very straightforward, and it is, but this data takes a lot of collecting. I enjoy it, but it's a perverse occupation. You just have to sit there for a long time. But once we have it, it means we can do all kinds of cool stuff. So we can look across the colony, for example, and work out how many eggs there are within different kinds of neighbourhoods. So this is just a simple example to get the point across, where we might look at the number of nests that have one neighbour, two neighbour, or three neighbours, how many of those kinds of nests there are. That's what the N value is. And then how many eggs are associated with that total grouping. So there are 11 eggs for those 10 nests with one neighbour in this sample. And then you can work out the rate of eggs per nest approximately for each of these different categories of site. We defined neighbours, and that's what this image is hoping to show you, in terms of birds sat next to another bird within pecking distance. So if you look at the three birds to the right of the image, three nests, sorry, to the right of the image, they're all neighbours of one another, sorry, because they can peck each other without having to stand up. But the birds down in the bottom left corner are not neighbours because they cannot be got by these three birds. But if you look carefully, you'll see they do have a neighbour, because you can see the tail and primaries sticking out from under the roof of that nest there. So that enables us to kind of go in and analyse data on a year-to-year basis. So our first year in June, we just simply calculated those means for Aztec Zorn. So you can see the closeness here, just fewer than one egg per nest for the entire colony using either estimation. But then if we do the neighbour analysis of the sort I've just shown you, you can then cluster them together into this kind of graphical presentation and do statistical analysis. And in this case, we find, despite the look of it, there's no actual significant difference in terms of the number of eggs per neighbourhood type, in terms of whether you've got one, two, or three neighbours and so forth. But we'd expect that at this point, because in order to get significant statistical variance up with a bird that only lays up to 3 eggs, we're going to need to collect a lot of data and power this across a number of years. And our ambition for this project is to run it for approximately 30 years, which is why recruiting research students and so forth, because I might not make it, but hopefully they will. So the other aspect, as I said, of this was collecting field notes as we passed by. So we had noted things, for example, like the presence of that lesser black-backed gull I showed you, very regular visiting habits, also regular habits from corvid species, predominantly ravens, and other gulls, including herring gulls. And we noticed courtship and copulation behaviours, particularly within 24 hours of a complete egg predation. We did see attempted copulation, which suggests these birds might be trying to squeeze in a second clutch, even though they on average don't do that, which is interesting. It suggests they're kind of maybe adapting to the predation threat. But we also have seen signs of, in this year, of clutches being abandoned because of probable infertility and attempted copulations again. So infertility might be an issue in the colony. It might be driving down numbers. And then we had further thoughts. As I said, this cliff nesting thing is kind of unusual. Most gull species nest on the ground, and the cliff nesting is believed to be an anti-predator defense. And the argument is that they've done this to avoid mobbing behaviors, but they only mob if they're really under high predation rates. And yet we were seeing the kind of stuff you see on this image a lot. So this made us think that predation might be a real problem for these birds. So that gave us, cause to think we should pursue the project further. So we went back again next year, did the same thing that I've just described, but we also categorized the ledges into narrow, wide, and medium, following some methods that have been developed for work on guillemots. So there's lots of guillemot guys and girls on Lundy, so they're useful people to talk to. And we basically looked at things like the number of vertical walls that were around the nest, whether the nest had a roof above it, like the one I showed you in the previous image, and so forth. And we measured the number of predatory birds flying within 10 meters, because we assumed that there would be a definite flyby to gather information about what was on the nest. So we were trying to look and see if certain nests were more exposed and others were less so, and so forth. We also zoned the colony into distinct AON clusters, apparently occupied nest clusters. Sorry, I keep doing that. So we got 4 zones here, and then zone E was all the others who didn't fit into those clusters. And you'll see there's a blue dotted line across that image, which is the upper and lower portions or positions on the colony. And that line basically is as high as we've seen the sea hitting in really bad weather, that bad enough for us to be down there still. So it suggests that these birds in the lower reaches can actually be significantly challenged by the elements, extreme elements. We did the descriptive statistics again for average clutch size, just using the last day method because we were confident that would be as good as the other method. And there were no interactions between any of these characteristics for this particular year, 2016. But what we did notice was a huge uniformity in this particular colony in terms of the actual structural features of the nest. They're all pretty much the same as one another. So we didn't pursue that any further for this particular colony. That's interesting in itself. There's sort of a uniformity there, which might suggest that's why only a portion of the cliff is used, that's what they like. We then were able to compare 48 common nests between the 2 years, because there'd been some new birds arriving, some nests get wiped out by storm weather and so forth, as I've suggested, so they get rebuilt in slightly different positions. And we were able to see, in fact, that the mean clutch size was different between the 2 years for these 48 common nests, quite markedly so. So for the eagle-eyed amongst you, or the kittiwake-eyed amongst you, you will have seen that the mean for 2016 was significantly higher. It's above 1, it's about 1.42, if I remember rightly. So almost high enough for the colony to replace itself. When you pull out these particular nests, you see that that's very much different, and that indeed is statistically significant. So there's something much more successful going on in 2016 for this particular colony. But again, everything is pretty uniform as we suggested. So what that meant was we needed to move on to gather more data. We're still working Aztec Zorn, but we also moved south, so we literally across that spur that I showed you in the image of the site by a few meters, and then looked into Aztec Bay proper, where there are 3 panels of kittiwakes nesting. And we repeated exactly the same processes that I've just been discussing with the Zorn since 2017. So we have 3 years data for that colony now, those 3 colonies really at that site. Dean is helping us enormously this year in collecting data for us while we can't be there. We hope we'll get Kirsty onto the island for the chick stage next month if we're lucky. But Dean's been a superb friend in all of this, as I'm sure you would expect. But here you can see a graph that's just giving you a sense of what's going on in terms of the egg counts using the last day method, chicks counted later on in the season, so toward the end of July or into August when they're fledged, basically ready to go, and then the conversion rate. Now you'll notice, if you're interested in statistics, if you look at AB3 17 and 18, which is Aztec Bay Panel 3 2017 and 18, that the data doesn't quite look logical. So you've got some fewer eggs than you've got chicks in 2017. That's actually simply because of missing data issues. But when we calculate the conversion, that's purely for the nests where we had egg counts. So that conversion rate is comparable across all of those data points that I'm showing you here. So what you see is a lot of noise. You also see a lot of variance captured by the confidence intervals. And one thing to note is that that variance is much reduced in panel 1, which is the closest panel, and much more easily observed than panels 2 and 3. And so this is also possibly, issues to do with observer trends. Even though we've got good inter-rater reliability on our observations, it's much harder to pick up eggs further away right over the bay from the observation point. So that helps us to later parcel out the data and analyze it in chunks where we're more confident about our estimates, but also then to compare that to data where we're less confident. So what's next? So we're kind of getting this baseline picture of what these birds are doing and how successful they are. And of course, we're feeding that back to Dean and to relevant parties. We've noticed that there was no predation at all in 2016, which was very different from 2015. So it's possible that that increase in clutch size was actually an indicator of predation being reduced. There are a few things we noted. rabbit abundance was much increased during 2016, and rabbit carcasses were being left all over the place by, after having been culled by farming staff, which make much better food source for the large gulls and much easier to get. And we suspect they just shifted their foraging strategy to that, away from the kittiwakes, which was beneficial. But we've also noticed that in the last year in particular, with the massive rise in guillemot numbers back to their former glory, which is a truly awesome thing to see, actually. It's also kind of cynically good news for the kittiwake team, because the guillemot chicks and eggs are much easier to predate, and the larger gulls are going for those and have been leaving our kittiwakes alone. So we suspect changes in the community ecology have actually shifted changes in predation, and then that had onward effects in terms of the community structure. All the time we've been collecting the data I've told you, we've also been collecting various behavioural data. So we've been videoing these nests, all of these nests, all of the time. So we have a huge archive of video behaviour where we're coding up parental attendance, the interactions between the parents and the chicks, and the interactions between chicks on two chick nests. And that's because when chicks start to get aggressive with one another, that can lead to siblicide. And when you see siblicide, it's usually an indicator of food stress. And way back in 1980, my father observed siblicide for the first time at Puffin Gully. And then it occurred on many occasions. And that was the beginning of the end for that colony. It was an indicator that these birds were just not finding food source. So we're keeping a check on that as an indicator. But we're also interested in the actual nature of the behavioural interactions more generally, because we want to see whether or not the parents are in fact good parents, whether there are differences between the nests and so forth. So that leads me to conclude. I've probably told you too many things too fast, which I apologise for. I should like to thank help we've received from Becky, the former warden, when we started all this work, and from Dean, the current warden. They were enormously and are enormously useful people, and we couldn't have done this without them. And as I said, Dean's really stepped up and helped us this year. So thank you so much, Dean. And my wife, son and daughter for actually giving me my liberty. The image in the background there is Lowestoft Pier, where we're also doing this work with an urban population. And the advantage of this population is twofold or threefold. They're ringed by the ringing group there, who've been very helpful. Some of them have GPS locators on them, and you can walk along that pier and lift the plank and count the eggs, and it takes you 15 minutes instead of 2 weeks. If you want to read more about our work on Lundy, we've published it in the Field Society Journal. Thank you.
Tom, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I started this evening knowing almost nothing about kittiwakes, so I feel like I've learnt a huge amount.
Okay, good.
So thanks very much for that. It's led me on to a question, because you were talking about the predation of the nests and so on. A few weeks ago, we had Chris D here, who was talking about bird ringing and so
Yes.
on, and he covered the seabird recovery project, which eliminated all of the rats. What impact do you think that's had on the kittiwake population?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. And you'll notice I was looking at data from 2008 because I was kind of intrigued about that actually in the background. I decided not to talk about that tonight. But I think the impact is indirect, because the rats were unlikely to be getting out onto the ledges directly for the kittiwakes. But the indirect effect is that the increased breeding success of the other auk populations, notably obviously the puffins, making predation there an opportunity for the larger gulls, which is possibly slightly easier. But even if it's not easier, it just statistically dilutes the overall kind of predation risk for the kittiwakes. So basically, the more birds there are of different varieties, you should expect to see some distribution of the predation threat. But it is also worth noting that actually the predator numbers when predator numbers, by which I mean the large gulls, so the greats, the lasses, and the herrings, pretty much in decline as well. And so the actual kind of population shifts for these species would be very interesting. And we haven't had the resources to properly monitor breeding success for the predatory gulls on the island, but we would really love to do that, because if we could get that data as well, then we would begin to get some of your standard kind of data for predator-prey interactions, which we could then model and see if we're seeing what the model predicts.
Thank you, thank you. And I'll just remind everybody who's watching at home to enter your questions using the Q&A function. We've got a few questions coming in already, so I'm going to move on to Emma Whittam's question. Emma asks, how many days, weeks, or even months do you spend observing and recording on Lundy?
But personally, I go for a 2-week stretch at the beginning of June to kick off the field season. But then my colleague and PhD student Kirsty goes back again a number of times to collect data throughout the breeding season. So we get the whole package. We haven't managed to put somebody on there permanently for the entire effort, but we're sort of top and tailing it. And then as indicated, there's useful data flowing in from the warden and his team. And then similarly at Lowestoft, but at Lowestoft we don't go there because basically I can drive to Lowestoft. It's a short answer, so I can go there for day trips and collect data and come back. So we go there as much as we can at the beginning and the end of the season, but Kirsty goes there quite often herself in between as well. So it's the whole, we get it covered between us basically.
I mean, you must have introduced quite a lot of students to Lundy over the years on your various field trips. I mean, you were one yourself. How many people do you think you've introduced to Lundy over the years?
Oh golly, several hundred. Yeah, it's. I should really have counted it. I sometimes regret this. We did have a very good habit of photographing each year the team on the steps of the barn, which I know other groups do, and we kind of just, I don't know why, we just got out of the habit, so we kind of lost the archive, which is a real shame. But yeah, lots and lots. I mean, we keep the barn busy, and occasionally you also have extra accommodation. So yeah, we bring quite a few through. Yeah, it's nice. I'm glad to. And they come back. What's great about it is they come back on their own and bring their families and things as well. So it's good.
In the same way that you did.
Yes, yeah, it's a habit.
Okay, so going back or going on to sort of observation of the nest, Clive Smith. Hello, Clive. Clive managed to get a question in every week. He says, do you make your observations only around breeding time?
No, no. That's a good. I didn't talk about that. That's a very good question. No, we try and schedule them across the entire daylight period. So from dawn till dusk. So we do this in shift work. So well, one of us will go down there and be down there at sort of 4:30, 5 in the morning, and then someone will come and relieve them at lunch. And we like to have a bit of overlap so we can give each other an update about what's happened and if anything unusual has gone on, because things do happen, rocks fall off and stuff, and disturbances happen. But and then carry on the work across the day, so we get a good sampling of times a day. Well, we've got better and better at that actually. So in the original paper that I just referenced, we did a pretty good effort, but we're much more hardworking now, I guess is the fair way of putting it. We realized we were missing stuff, but it's not so much about feeding for this basic data. We have also thought actually about going at night, because there's we chatted with Luke Sutton, the peregrine guy, about peregrine predation of kittiwakes, and he was telling us that there's some evidence they actually creep onto the ledges. It's a very non-standard peregrine behaviour from people who sort of seen them flying around taking birds. But we have talked with Dean about maybe putting some night vision camera traps out if we can to see what's going on, which would get us some data as well, because they're active. When we get there at dawn, they're active already. They've been doing things, so we would like that data too.
Going back to my point I made that I didn't really know very much about kittiwakes. I don't know what happens to kittiwakes when they're not on Lundy and they're not breeding. What does the kittiwake do for the rest of the year?
They spend the rest of their year in the Atlantic. They don't come on land at all. They don't like to fly across land either. If you watch them, you'll never see them fly across Lundy. They go round. So the only time they come onto land is to sit on their ledges and also to gather nesting material for the nests. So you'll see them occasionally pulling up clumps of thrift and things from the sidings. But yeah, no, they go out and they separate as well from their partner actually. So whilst they're monogamous, they they will go out and spend the rest of the year away from their partner. They may well be with other kittiwakes, but not their life partner. So then when they come back in sort of March, April to the seas near Lundy and then start revisiting their nest, they also go through a kind of courtship routine, which kind of reacquaints them with their partner and cements the bond again, so they then get on with the breeding effort. That in itself is interesting, but we're leaving that for other projects for later. But that may well have some predictive value for how successful they are.
You mentioned the sort of reuniting the pairs in the courtship. I've got a question from Jan Paul, who asks, when another bird tries to go onto an occupied nest, could it be mistaken identity?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Without being mean to my birds, and I do love them, sometimes not all of them are tremendously sharp, and so they do make errors, and sometimes you see an error like that, and you can kind of tell it's an error because they don't really commit to the aggression. They just get out of trouble and leave. So it's not that they're intending to do an attack to oust the pair. So you kind of monitor the duration of the interaction, really. But so you think, oh, that was just unlucky, because the flight control in those narrow spaces is extraordinary. They're very agile birds. But then some of them will persistently do the same mistake quite often. And I suspect that they are probably young breeders just getting used to the colony. And the general kind of kittiwake literature, particularly stuff produced by John Coulson, who's one of the main sort of researchers in this area, it suggests that inexperienced breeders make all kinds of rookie mistakes early on, and it takes them a while to get used to kind of colony etiquette. So, yeah.
Thank you. Question from Ian Campbell. Good to hear from you, Ian. Are there any other seabirds nesting within the kittiwake colonies?
Yeah, I was trying to indicate that visually. I didn't have time to talk about that, but there are, yes. So you have kittiwakes, and then basically their nearest next neighbours are the guillemots, because the guillemots quite like very similar ledges. But whilst guillemots don't build a physical nest, the structure of the ledges are quite similar. So we use some of that ledge architecture literature to adapt to how we describe the kittiwake situation, in fact, from the guillemot stuff. And then you have razorbills in cavities and so forth near those. And then above on the sidings, we've got quite a lot of puffins doing the thing. And at Aztec Zorn, we have predatory birds nesting there too. So you've got there, so you've got a great black-backed pair just behind on a rock promontory, and then some other stuff going on. So yeah, it's a busy place, quite a cacophony. And the space at Aztec Bay is getting really filled up with guillemots in a minute. It's great.
I've got a few comments coming in from our audience. Sue Maguire says, "Dear Tom, we're enjoying your presentation and learning great things. It's great to have publicity about the famous Lundy puffins, but of course there are lots of other wonderful creatures and birds, including kittiwakes."
Yeah, I agree. I love puffins, but I'm glad someone said that.
Brian and Lita Woodcock say, "Many thanks for a super and fascinating talk."
Oh, thank you.
Our very own Dave Richards has a question. He says, "What would you regard to be a healthy population on Lundy?"
One that has a mean clutch size of about 1.6, which is a very technical answer, but when you're getting to around that number, you're definitely going to be able to replace those birds, given the longevity that they have, and given kind of stochastic random risk from predation and so forth kind of interfering with that. When you're about that many eggs, as long as that's consistently done over the years, you should get a good replacement. So that's what we're looking for. So we're not at that yet, but the numbers are looking promising in Aztec Bay.
Thank you. I've two questions here, which I'll ask at the same time. The first is from Liza Cole. Good to have you here, Liza. Do you have any theories as to why the populations at the north of the island have declined before those further south? And David Can asks, is the Aztec colony the only one left?
No, okay, so the first was about theories about the depletion popping around from Puffin Gully. Yeah, I have some theories. I mean, in the sense that they won't surprise you, I guess, because the first one is about predation again, and puff and gully in particular was actually quite accessible, I think. Not many people go down there anymore, but if ever you do scramble down there, you'll see that it's not very hard particularly for ravens to predate down there. And we certainly noted the presence of ravens very often when we were there doing data for my father's project and other stuff. So I suspect that's played a role, but then also that's where the siblicide kicked in. And so we think that colony also suffered massive food stress. And what's the thing that I didn't quite pull out about the siblicide was that food stress is something that's kicking in after they've made their clutch size decisions. So if they've been bold enough, to put it sort of anecdotally, to go for 2 eggs under sort of cues for resourcing for that, and then food stress happens during the chick phase, that's kind of bad news. And it suggests various things about the birds not being able to monitor quite the nature of the risk, not being able to keep up with the data, basically. And that may well have collapsed them as well. What I don't know is how many of those birds kind of crept around and then tried, going around to long roost, for example, and then dropping down. So some of our birds on the colonies we're looking at in the Aztec Bay area may well be ancestors of those birds, who may just have dispersed when they were finding their own colonies. None of them will be actual original birds there because of lifespan problems. But so there may have been some shifting. But I suspect predation and food stress are the main issues. It could also just be an issue about it just being that little bit more tricky for them to get to foraging grounds compared to on the other side, and that could just make a competitive difference in terms of time to get to the foraging sites, and that's possible, but I think that'll be marginal. In terms of other colonies on the island, which was the second question, yeah, there are some, but there's supposed to be some around the back of Shutter Rock down the bottom, which aren't accessible, and then there's a load in the very narrow gullies into Jenny's Cove, but they're super hard to observe. We can get counts of them, so the AON stuff's there, but you can't really see into the nests. And the only way really to do that would probably be pretty invasive, and so we're not interested in doing that. So, yeah.
Thanks. I think I spotted a question from Nicola Heading as well, who was asking a very similar question about do the Kittiwakes nest on other parts of Lundy as well. So I think we've answered that one at the same time. So. Okay. Let's choose another question. Here's an interesting one. Clive Smith again. Are there similarities between Lundy and Lowestoft observations?
Well, yes and no. I mean, so that again, that's a nice question because it's driving at what our hypothesis might be in the background. So the Lowestoft population, you can see behind me the pier, which is the one we're using at the minute, but they actually also, somewhat like in Newcastle and South and North Shields, so they're nesting on all the buildings in town as well, including, they've got a wonderful colony on the church actually, which the vicar let us got the church tower and look down, see if we could get some good data, but that's another story. But these guys are much easier to observe, which is why we're working on them, but they're doing much better basically. They are foraging really successfully. They're having good returns on their eggs and chicks. They're in much better state. We know where they're foraging from the GPS data that's a project being run by a guy called Mike Swindles, who I should mention because that's his work, but he's happy sharing the data with us. They've also, him and his team have done some gullet analyses of what they're bringing back, and they're getting a mixed diet, but definitely getting sand eels in their diet as well. So they're getting what they need, which might not be too surprising because just up the road from that pier is the Bird's Eye factory where all of the UK's fish fingers are made. So maybe they're wise and just going on there, but they're much more successful. But that's what's interesting about it. And we're really intrigued by this, them as urban birds, because they're not like the urban herring gulls or lesser blackbacks who have made a living out of extracting anthropogenic food resource, which is another way of saying stealing your chips in St Ives. But these guys, they live on artificial structures, but they forage like wild birds. They don't eat anything that we produce in the town or anything like that. So we're intrigued about the real estate and what's, is this, we don't see any predation. We think they're pretty sheltered. They're very uniform nest structures because the humans built them. So yeah, that's the differences seem to be driven by the physical structures. We think it's a long story to tell yet. So
I'm going to bring us back to Lundy. We've got loads of questions now to get through, so I'm going to move us on. Ali Shepherd asks, sorry if I've missed this, but how long is the breeding season on Lundy?
Well, it's the same as most everywhere else. They will start, true kind of reproductive effort in May, and lay their eggs the end of May, which will hatch into mid-June, which is why we're there in the first couple of weeks of June. And then those chicks will go through till the end of July and be fully fledged and ready to go in August, basically. And by ready to go, they'll be immature birds who won't breed for a couple of years, but they're independent. So.
Great, thank you. John Tyra says, really fascinating stuff. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Let's hear from you, John. Gareth Davis asks, are you doing any counts of sand eels brought back to the nest?
Yeah, we're hoping. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, there's a second part as well. So if sand eel decline is part of the problem, would we expect to see a similar impact on puffins?
Well, yes, that's a very good point, but it's slightly mitigated by the foraging strategies of the two birds. So Kittiwakes are surface divers, as I was indicating, so they dive down to about 50 centimetres to take out the food, whereas puffins and the other auks, guillemots, go much, much deeper. So the changes in the sea column shouldn't be problematic. But it's kind of more interesting than that in a way, because actually the more of those auk species you have around, that also generates social information for Kittiwakes. And the way the hunting kind of works is that you get the diving auk species that will go down, and they go underneath the sand eels and drive them to the surface and take them as they go to the surface, which actually pushes them up for the Kittiwakes. So if you ever see one of those feeding frenzies out off the coast, you sometimes see them off the west coast. That's what's happening. They're being driven up. Sometimes you see dolphins involved in it as well. That gets destroyed when the gannets turn up. Everything disperses then, but they kind of help one another effectively. Well, they get helped by the auk species. So having them around is useful to drive up food resource that might not be there. But we've got all this video data, and when we see feeds, we're counting where we can see what it is. We're making a note of it, and also we have access to Grant's guillemot films where we can get food counts off that, and they're actually very close to our Kittiwakes. They're in the same area, so it gives us a sense of what they're bringing back as well. So we're getting.
Staying with the sand eels. It's a bit of a tongue twister, that. Peter Long asks about the climate change element. Is the decline curve in Kittiwakes mirrored by other sand eel dependent species, indicating eel mass decline, or are other species which can feed at greater depths holding their numbers more successfully?
Yeah, it's ragged, I guess. Yeah, so yeah, the Kittiwakes are suffering the most, but other things have been impacted. The key thing, though, isn't just about the numbers are crucial, but it is also the weird dependency that Kittiwakes seem to have on this food source. And so the general argument is that they're effectively food specialists in breeding season, and that their young really need these year zero sand eels. So that means they were hatched in November and they're getting fed to the chicks in June. There's been one experimental study done on this where they've demonstrated that the particular lipid content and some other nutrition in the sand eels has a big impact on brain development in Kittiwakes, such that if they don't have sufficient, their foraging habits are poorer when they're adults. So it affects their ability to find food. And so there is possibly some rather nasty feedback in this system, which might drive down their success beyond that would be merely predicted by a reduction in numbers of sand eels.
Thank you. I've still got loads of questions to get through here, so we're not going to be able to cover them all. But we'll keep going. We've got another 20 questions here at the moment, but Well, I'll pick some of them out. Peter Claburn asks, are kittiwakes essentially faithful to the same colony, or do they move between colonies on the island or other Bristol Channel colonies?
They're essentially faithful, but we do think that, I mean, it's known, in fact, in other places that if they sort of fail for a while, they will move. So I think as the Aztec Zorn birds are failing, some of them are moving to the bay, I think. But we don't know that because we've been not able to ring these birds. But I'd be very surprised if that's not happening. And others will disperse elsewhere, maybe going, further into the Celtic Sea and finding Irish coastline and that kind of stuff.
So that leads nicely on to John Wilson's question. Are kittiwake populations increasing anywhere in Northern Europe? And also, I've got a question from our chairman. It says it's from Sandra Rowland, but I imagine it's from Alan. He says, you mentioned the reduction in sites historically, but is there any evidence of increases in site locations on Lundy?
That's a good question. I don't know, and if anyone knows how to find that out, I'd be interested to look at that kind of data. That would be nice. The increase elsewhere in Europe, yeah, their numbers are. I mean, actually, their numbers have slightly increased this year in the UK, so there is some reason for hope, actually. So we had a slight upward fluctuation, and on Lundy, the last year the numbers were better as well, just generally. So that's including all the Jenny's Cove counts and stuff. So yeah, I mean, if you go up into the Arctic Circle of that direction, you're going to find a much better kittiwake story. Yeah. And that's what we think's happening. Some of the sand eels are just being driven up that way, basically. So.
Quick question here from David Can. What are the nests made of?
Yeah, well, mostly they're made of grass and thrift and mud, and they're patted down into platforms, which kind of like they kind of look like you've sawn a section out of a coconut tree, really, if you look at it side on, but very messy one. And then they have a sort of helpful kind of guano finish, which can kind of keep them together a bit. But increasingly, we do see evidence of plastics and plastic ties from fishing boats and that kind of stuff getting inserted into them, woven into the kind of fabric. So that's something we notice.
Steve Simmons asks, is the trend in the kittiwake population that has been observed on Lundy consistent with what's been observed in other areas of the UK and elsewhere?
Yeah, I guess it is. So, as I suggested, there was kind of a biased focus towards northern populations in the UK, mainly just because of where researchers were located, I guess. But the Lundy situation is mimicking what's been discussed there. And also, I spend quite a lot of time in Cornwall when there's not a pandemic, and I've been monitoring just. My wife won't let me out that much, so because we're on holiday there, but I nip out for an afternoon, and I've been watching particular sites around, sort of down from around St Ives Bay, then all around the bottom to Rinsey on the other side, and they're disappearing as well. That's less surprising in a way because nesting on mainland coast is not their favoured choice, but even on some of the little islands where they used to be, they're not there anymore. So.
We've got a few questions that sort of about you mentioned that kittiwakes are not ringed, the ones that you're
not on Lundy, yeah.
No, but I think there are a number of questions along this line, but I'm going to read Joanne Wilby's question, which is how do you know that pairs mate for life if they're not being ringed and you can't individually identify them?
Well, we know that from prior studies. So that was a generic statement about the sort of basics of kittiwake life history. It is, of course, perfectly possible that we may have some weird variation in fidelity with our colony. I haven't got a reason to predict that at the moment, but I guess I have a slight reason to predict maybe the divorce rate might be at its kind of top end. So the divorce rate in kittiwakes on average is about 11% due to reproductive failure. And it's possible that might be driven a bit higher because there may be something going on here that we don't know about, which would require, more stringent invasive work to the birds, which is not what we do. But we just banking on them being pretty normal on the monogamy side, and that of course has been done by ringing and the usual methods. So we did have an idea though. We kind of got interested in trying to recover feathers from our birds, which would give us some potential biochemical routes to tracking birds across time if we know where we're getting them from. But our main interest in that actually is because it's a good measure of corticosteroid metabolism and looking how stressed these birds are, which would be an indicator of what they're going through. So we're hoping to get hold of some of those.
I'm going to move us on to our last couple of questions now. There's just a few more comments coming in. Maggie Hitchens says, another hour well spent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Liza Cole says, brilliant talk, totally fascinating. Thank you. We've had a few questions also about the predation. And I've picked this one out from Joe Marshall, who asks, what have you personally seen predate the birds' eggs or their nestlings?
The lesser blackbacks are pretty formidable. I've seen greats as well successfully have a go. Herring gulls seem to be less good at it, but they occasionally try. And then I've seen an adult kittiwake taken by a peregrine.
Debbie Fraser says, thank you very much for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
We've got more questions also about the sand eels and the feeding. Oh gosh, too many to choose from. Let's take Kevin Waterfall's question here. Where do the birds go to get their sand eels, and what is the water depth at that location?
That we don't precisely know, but following useful chats with Grant Sherman previously around his guillemot research and looking, in fact, a wonderful talk he gave in where you're sat now in the Morisco in the wheel room. He talked about how there's a particular kind of algal bloom in the Celtic Sea. I've forgotten precisely where the ridge is, but basically it's several miles away as you fly off towards Ireland, so past Skomer and Skocum and off towards Ireland. And that's where those birds go as well, from Skomer and Skocum. And basically you've got a kind of a self-generating sort of phyto and zooplankton system there, which then enables the sand eels to come in, and then the other birds come in and go there. And so the suspicion is that's probably where they're heading, because that's where a lot of the other local seabirds in that broader sense of local go. But we don't have the GPS trackers on, or any other kind of tracker. You know, that would be nice to do that basically, but that's a whole other project. Yeah. Okay,
well, we've really run out of time now, but Tom, I think you said that you'd be happy to have people contact you to ask any further questions.
Absolutely. You can easily find me on the internet, and I'm at Middlesex University, so please do just drop me an email. And
was your email address on your last slide? I don't know if you want to pop your last slide back up on the screen again.
Let me just scroll through. I don't think I did actually. I'll tell you what I did. I think on the very first slide, I hang on, let me go to share screen. That would help. Sorry.
Yeah.
And on the very first slide, you will see my website, and that's all you need to know. You can get to me through there. So
there we go. Yeah. So if anybody's watching,
my spelling.
Yes. Yeah. Make sure you get the spelling right. Yeah. So if anybody wants to drop Tom a line, you can find his contact details on his website and follow up the questions, particularly if I didn't get around to reading yours out. So that's it. Just a few thanks, Tom. Few things to run through before we wrap up. Other than firstly, I need to start by thanking you, Tom, for joining me this evening. It's been really fascinating talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
We also mustn't forget Dave Richards in the background, who's hosted this Zoom session. It's also my turn to share my screen and put in the weekly plug to join the Lundy Field Society. So please do support these talks by joining the LFS. Membership's open to all. You don't have to have any particular special interests in Lundy. You can find out more by visiting the website, which is on the screen, or finding us on social media. So please do join us. So next week we return to our normal slot of 7:30. Trevor Doby and B. Cox will be here to talk about the LFS working parties that have been taking place over many years, and they're going to be sharing some of their experiences about when things may not have gone quite as planned. I think it's going to be a really entertaining talk. The following week we're going to do something completely different. Paul Connolly will be joining me to talk about how Lundy has inspired him to write poetry and a couple of novels about the island. Paul's going to be reciting some of his work, including a specially written poem for the lockdown. And we also want to get some audience involvement in this. So we're going to launch a Lundy Limerick competition. So we'll be asking you for your witty and entertaining contributions into a Limerick competition. I'll post more of that on social media and email it around to LFS members over the coming week. That's in 2 weeks' time. As ever, if you're joining us on Zoom, you'll receive a link to a feedback survey when this session comes to an end, and I'd be really grateful if you could complete that. Your feedback's always been very, very helpful. That's about it, really. So, Tom, would you like to say your goodbyes?
Yeah, goodbye. Thank you so much for the great questions. It was very enjoyable for me too to be caused to think all those things. So thank you very much. Thanks, Tom. And that's it from us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it and look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye-bye.